And he says, you have 200 camels of mine, and I want them back. And he said, the Habashi said to him, you know, when you came in here and I saw you, I was very impressed. But I've lost my, respect for you because I'm about to destroy your most sacred sanctuary, and you're asking me about your camel? And Abdul Muttalib said, oh, the house has a Lord. He'll take care of it. I'm the Lord of camels, and I have to look after my camels. In other words, you know, I don't have any business. The house, that's not my problem. My problem's my camels. So he gave him his camels back. So he goes off. Now, he meets this Arab who he knows, and he tells him, you know, they can't do anything. But he asks him to tell the leader of the elephanteer who's leading the elephant. He asks him, to give a message to the elephant, Unais, and he actually tells the elephant they're going to destroy the house of Allah. And there was another elephanteer who actually died in Mughammas, and he was brought as a guide, a dalil, to show them how to get to the Kaʿba, and he dies in Mughammas. And Ibn Hisham says the Arabs have stoned his grave since then. Now, what happens is this elephant, whose name is supposed to be Mahmud, that's what's mentioned in the book, he stops in Wad al-Muhassir, which is in the rites of Hajj. You're supposed to go quickly through it, between Arafah and Mina. He stops there. Now, at that point, Abraha should have realized, something's going on here. But people that get something in their minds, like the Pharaoh, become very stubborn and stop seeing signs, blinded. So what happens is they're hitting this animal to try to get it up to go, and it won't go. So they turn the direction back towards the Yemen. It gets up and it starts walking. And then they turn it towards another direction, and it'll do that. When they face it towards Mecca, it goes down. They just, continue on. They don't care. And Abraha tells his troops, continue on. They're going to raise the Kaaba. At this point, something very extraordinary happened, and that is birds, very large, that were seen flying over the Mecca, heading towards Wad al-Muhassir. These birds were described to be like bats. They looked like bats. And they come from Shu'aybiyah, which was the port of the Meccans. They come from that direction, near Jeddah. And they have 3 pellets, the size of a chickpea, 1 in the beak and 2 in their claws. And they begin to fly down onto this army, thrusting and spitting these pellets like bullets. And they pierce the people. And they all start dying. And obviously this creates a complete havoc in the Arabs and in the Habashi, and they start fleeing. And not all of them were hit. And they start fleeing. Abraha, some say he was hit and died from that, and others say that he actually escapes and dies not soon after that, immediately after that. Now, the important thing about this story is, one, it's a story that goes under the category in hadith of mutawatir. In other words, so many people witnessed it, and it was transmitted by these people who witnessed it to so many people that it becomes mutawatir amongst the Arabs. In other words, it wasn't a lie. They saw birds come, and they saw these birds fling these stones and kill all of these soldiers. And the important thing also to remember is, at the time when Li'ilaf Quraysh was revealed, there were still people alive who had seen that event. And none of them said it's a fairy tale. None of them said this didn't happen. They knew that it was true. And they were being reminded by Allah, don't you remember that sign Allah showed you? That this house is really Allah's house? And so they saw that house, and it comes to be known as al-Fil, which is also very important because the Arabs tend not to be very, traditionally they did not keep track of dates. So, they oftentimes would not know when somebody's born. And this is true still to this day. If you go into like Mauritania in the deep desert, a lot of them don't know how old they are. And you ask them what year they were born, they just say, I don't know. But if they were born in a year where some big event occurred, they always remember when they were born. Oh, he was born in the year of the flood. Right? He was born. Now, Am Fil was an extremely significant year for the Arabs. And the Prophet ﷺ is born in this year. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, Amina becomes pregnant. And, another important thing is after that, the Quraysh were called by the other Arabs, the Ahlullah, right? The people of Allah. In other words, their respect went way up on the meter of, right? Don't mess with Quraysh. That was the message to the other Arabs. Really, this is very important, right? Because it's establishing something about Quraysh. These are special people. And they live in a special place, and don't mess with them, because if you do, birds will appear out of nowhere and destroy you. I mean, that was really the message to the rest of the Arabs. So it's an important message, and they got it. They got it. They understood it. So what happens is, now, Abdullah, the son of Abdul Muttalib, was in Palestine during that time. He used to go on the caravans, and on the way back, he stops to visit his blood relative, Akhwad, right? Because his mother Salma is from them, and so he used to stop there. Now, Yathrib was famous for a fever. They had a fever there, very well known. It was a very strong fever, and people would die from it. And they got ill from this fever. And in fact, all of the Sahaba, most of them came down with that fever when they made the hijrah, and the Prophet made a dua to remove the fever from Medina and put it into Rabigh, which is a deserted place now. It used to be occupied, but that fever actually did leave Mecca or Medina. But his father, Abdullah, becomes sick with this fever and dies there, right? Which is, again, going to be very significant, which means his father died and was buried in Medina, right? So again, establishing ties with Medina. And there's actually a really interesting story that's related in some of the Sirah literature, in which a Yemeni king wanted to go and conquer Yathrib, and he goes there, and he laid siege to it. This was, a few centuries before the Prophet ﷺ. He laid siege to it, and at night, the Arabs of Yathrib, who are originally Yemenites, another very important thing too, establishing a very strong tie with the Yemenis, who will become great scholars and great supporters of the Prophet ﷺ through Bani Ash'ar, the Ash'ariyin. But this, they sent food out at night when the battle, because the Arabs used to fight in the daytime, they didn't fight at night. So these Yathribis sent food out to the soldiers at night. And this Yemeni king was so struck by this. He said, who are these people? We're coming to fight them, and they're sending up. And so he asked to see their leaders, and they came out. And he said, why are you sending us food? And he said, well, even though you're you're fighting us, you're still our guests, and we don't we don't want to be bad hosts. And he said, where is this character that you have? And he was told, some say that the last prophet will show up in this city. And so he actually said, I want to buy a house from you and leave it for that prophet, which was the house of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, which is where the Prophet ﷺ descended. So that tradition. So the point is, whether that's is true. There's no sanad for these things, but these are stories that show up in the seerah. The point is that you can very clearly see divine intervention constantly in this story. That Allah is guiding these events very clearly. Now, the Prophet ﷺ is born in that year. Amina now is without husband. According to Amina herself, she actually saw a light so bright that she could see the Christian castles of Busra, which is in Syria, which is another important place. Bahira, the monk, is there, and it also comes up again in the signs of the end of time. She heard a voice say to her, you are carrying in your womb Sayyid al-Qawm, the Sayyid of this people, the master of this people, and when he is born, say that you protect him, place him in protection of al-Wahid, from the evil of every envier, min sharri hasidin idha hasad, wa sammihi Muhammadan, and name him Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ibn Ishaq relates that. Now, she actually gives birth to him. Abdul-Muttalib is overjoyed that his beloved son Abdullah, who dies, nonetheless has a son. And at the same time, when he married Amina's cousin Hala, he also has his last son, which is al-Abbas. So this is important. Abbas is the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, but is born at the same time of the Prophet ﷺ. And he's a little older than the Prophet. He's just a few years older. And he actually greets the Prophet ﷺ, al-Abbas, in that story. So, now, the Prophet ﷺ is born and he's in the household of his grandfather, Abdul-Muttalib. But what was the tradition of the Arabs is that they would send their children to be wet nursed by Bedouin. And the reason for that is that the cities tended to be reasonably unhealthy. I mean, think about now. If they literally considered like Mecca to be an unhealthy environment because they said the air was not a good air. There were too many people living in it, so the anfas polluted the air. And they felt that the sedentary life was not healthy because they didn't move a lot. They tended to be less. I mean, now people sitting all day long and things like that. So you can imagine the difference then. Anyway, what would happen is that the Bedouins would come into Mecca and women would sit with their children. Now the Bedouin would look to see the powerful family because it's important to note the Arabs have a concept of ihsan prior to Islam. And the idea was if somebody gives you a good turn, you have to give them a good turn as well as a way of mukafa'ah, paying back. So it's not that they did things solely for that reason, but they recognized that that was part of their social structure. And this still to this day, like when I was in Arabia, in Mauritania in the desert, one of the things I was always struck by was the generosity of the Bedouin when you would you'd just be traveling and come to some tents and they'd say, oh, well, let's go and spend the afternoon in the tent till the sun goes away. They'd sacrifice a goat for you. They'd treat you like a king and all these things. And I asked Abdullah one time, why do they do that? I mean, what's really the emphasis behind it? And he says, well, first of all, karam, the idea of karam. It's important for him to display his generosity because it's from muru'ah, it's from the dignified nature of a person, and he prides himself in that he's kareem. But he said, but also, he's going to be in need sometime as well. And so he wants, and it goes back to the golden rule, do unto others, you would have them do unto you, right? And it's the same idea, is that you're going to be in need at some time. So hopefully, maybe one day you'll end up in that person's tent and they'll remember your ihsan to them. And so this is not really expecting immediate. Now, Abdullah did say to me also, which is interesting, he said, some people will give them something at that time just so they don't have to worry about him showing up at their door sometime, right? So there really was that idea of mukafa'ah. And it's in the hadith, if somebody does you a good turn, kafi'uhu, then show him, reciprocate his good. وَهَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. Is the reward of showing good to people other than the people that show good to you, that you show good to them, or that Allah shows good to you? Ahsan, kama ahsan Allahu ilayk. Show ihsan to people just as Allah has shown ihsan to you. He supported you, help other people. All these things. So they had this understanding. So what happens is, now at this time, another important thing to remember, this is an orphan now. Despite the fact it's Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib is getting old. He's already in his 70s. He's getting old. He is not going to be an important person. It's diminishing his authority in Quraysh. Also, from his sons, there's no one of great distinction that is really showing these kind of leadership qualities that are going to emerge. In fact, it's the Makhzumites now that are reemerging, and the Umayyads. Right? Now, what happens is that they get all these Qurayshi babies are taken by the different tribes. And Bani Sa'ad was one of the tribes that used to come down and take them. And Bani Sa'ad, it was a drought year. So the Arabs were having a hard time inside Mecca, but the Bedouin were also having a hard time outside. And Ḥalīma Saʿdiyya mentioned that during this time, there was no kala, like fodder for the livestock, so that the milk wasn't there. She didn't even have milk from her breast very much to give her own child who she was suckling. And she goes in hoping to get a good child. They're all taken and nobody's left except the Prophet ﷺ, who's with Amina, and he's an orphan. Right? And Amina doesn't have any money. And so Halima says to her husband, who's known as Ibn Abi Kabsha, she says to her husband, as they're about to leave, it's horrible that we're coming here and we came to get a child and we're going to go back without a child. And so she says, why don't we just take this orphan? Which is amazing also because her name, Halima, is somebody who's shows, concern and compassion for others. So this is definitely part of her nature. So she takes the baby, and Amina's pleased with this. Now, one of the things that she said also is maybe some barakah will come from taking. In other words, there's no material gain here, but maybe we'll get some barakah, some grace from Allah if we do, because it's an act of charity. She's recognizing we're being charitable, and maybe we'll get some ihsan from Allah. So there's a pure intention here. So she takes the child. Now, one of the things that happened is she had this wretched donkey that she rode into town with that was so emaciated, it could barely move. And as they're going back with Bani Sa'ad, her donkey's ahead of all the other donkeys. And the women are saying, where'd you get that donkey from? She said, it's the same one I came with. And they said, what happened to it? Because they saw it, she was lagging behind. And now she's in the forefront because she had the Prophet ﷺ. And then the other thing she noticed is when she begins to suckle him, her breasts fill up. Right? So she's witnessing something interesting is happening here. And then when she goes in back to where Bani Sa'ad is from, the other thing that happens, which is extraordinary, is that she sends her goats out and they come back full, whereas the other goats of Bani Sa'ad are coming back empty. And so they start telling the shepherds, go where Halima's goats are going. And they do it, but the same thing happens. So this barakah is entering the house or the khayma, the tent of Ḥalīma Saʿdiyya and her husband. And then what happens at another very significant event, when the Prophet ﷺ, he stays for 2 years, and he's weaned. They weaned him after 2 years. She takes him back to Amina, and she wants to keep him. And this was obviously a common thing. Wet nurse will get attached to the child because she's also considered a mother, right, to the Arab. And Amina wants the child, but she says, it was a bad year with them, and she convinces Amina that she wants to keep the baby for some more time until it gets strong, because the desert's going to be better for it. And so she goes back. When he's about 4 years of age, an event occurs that's very significant, and that is her son comes running and saying, the Qurayshis, something terrible's happened to the Qurayshi. And she says, what happened? She said, 2 men came, and they took a knife. And so obviously, you can imagine this woman's probably just in a total state of, she runs out and finds the Prophet ﷺ and asks him what happens, and he tells her that 2 men came, split in white, split his chest, took out the heart, put it in a bowl of ice, which I think is really significant, because if you've ever seen open heart surgery, either on film or live, the heart is in a bowl of ice. I guarantee you, you have to keep the heart in ice because it slows down the metabolic rate, and so the cells don't die. And then they poured on them the water of Zamzam, and this is, if you watch an open heart surgery, they pour cryonic fluid, which is a salty fluid that has electrolytes to nurture the cells of the heart. And Zamzam was more salty than it is now, but traditionally it was a very salty well, right? Malih, called Malih. And it would obviously have been very rich in potassium and in natrium muriaticum, which are the 2 dominant ingredients in cryonic fluids that are poured. And it was cold water, which is, they actually freeze the water and pour it over the heart while they're waiting to put it into the chest. And so here's these 2 angels who would obviously be completely sterile as well. They wouldn't have any germs on them. Quite literally, they would have been sterile beings, because that's another concern, is infection with operations, right? So that was open heart surgery. Now, at that time, that was something completely, who could think of that? Taking a heart out of a chest, splitting the chest, the sternum was split, splitting the sternum, taking out the heart, washing the heart, keeping it in ice. Where are you going to get ice in the middle of the desert? And then putting the heart back and sewing up. And there's 2 riwayas, one that said he didn't have an athar, and another said that there were actually stitched traces on his body, which is seen with people that have open heart surgery. You have stitches. The point, though, is this event happens. Halima believes it. She doesn't know what it means, but she knows it's something very big. And so she gets very nervous and takes the child back. And she gives the child back after saying that she was going to keep the child. Amina says, what's the matter? She says, nothing. No, you have to tell me what happened. She told him, and she said, I'm not worried because I know this child has a great sha'n, right, a great affair. And so that is a really major event in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And then what happens is the Prophet ﷺ, another major event is that the Prophet ﷺ's mother herself dies, right? And this is called the year of the 2 bereavements, right? Or not the year, but the 2 bereavements, Bahuznain. And this is when, his mother dies, and then 2 years later, his grandfather dies, which is, so obviously this is very, very eventful for the Prophet ﷺ, because now he's an orphan, completely. His grandfather's dead, his mother's dead, and his father's dead, and he's only 8 years old, right, or 7 years of age. And one of the things that happened also that is significant here is that Abdul Muttalib used to take the Prophet ﷺ to the Dar al-Nidwa, and he would ask him his opinion when he's 7 years old. And the Arabs, just, what are you asking him for? And he said, don't worry. He said, this boy has a great future, right? So he recognized in him this. Now, he dies, and then before he dies, he entrusts Abu Talib. Now, if you look on your sheet here, you can see out of those sons, there's Zubair, Abu Talib, Abu Lahab, Abdullah, Al-Abbas, Hamza, and then the daughters. Abu Talib is entrusted with the Prophet ﷺ. So obviously Abdul Muttalib is choosing the one that he felt would be the best for the Prophet, and Abu Talib is going to have Ali and Ja'far, who become very important Sahaba. And then another event happens which is very significant. And this is an event, one of the things that Abu Talib used to do is that he would go to Syria, and he would purchase things, sell things, and then come back. And so he was a merchant. And he, at one point, takes his son. Now the Prophet is considered his son in terms of the Arab, the uncle when he takes over he's like a father to the child. He takes the Prophet ﷺ when he was 12, some say 9, and they get to Busra in Greek, but Busra in Arabic. And now Busra was a stop along the way. And one of the things about Busra is that there was a monk's cell there that was very well known, and there was a monk there whose name was Bahira. And some say it was Jarjis, which is in Greek Sergius. Bahira was a monk who knew about the end of time. That was one of his specialties. And some of these monks maintained these traditions and transmitted them to each generation. So he actually knew that there was a prophet coming soon. And he didn't know when, but he knew that he was coming and that he would be from amongst the Arabs. And he used to watch these Arab caravans come, and he knew that he would visit that spot. And there was actually a tree there that he was told that the last prophet would come to this place. So he was very concerned about this. And what happens is that one day an Arab caravan comes, and this is the caravan that has Abu Talib in it, and Bahira notices something, and what he notices is a cloud over the caravan, giving it sun that moves with it, which he thought was very unusual. And so he, that night, he asks the Quraysh to come and have dinner with him in his monastery. The Quraysh think, what's going on? He's never even said hello to us, right? So they thought it was very unusual, and they answer him, and they bring everybody but the Prophet ﷺ, who's 12 years old, and at that age, in their environment, 12-year-olds would look after the camels and things, because he wasn't a man yet. And so Bahira's looking around, and he says, is everybody here? And they said, yes. He said, no, somebody's missing. They said, the only one missing is, we have a young boy, he's looking after things. He said, no, he has to come. And so they say, oh, you're right, we should have thought of that. And so they out and go get him and bring him. The Prophet comes in all through the dinner. Bahira's watching him. And at one point, Bahira asks him something by Lat. And the Prophet says, I don't like that name. And so now he knows something's up, because where's he getting that information? And so finally he asked to see his back. And on the back there was a raised, between the shoulder blade, there was a raised circle. that had some hairs around it. And some say that there was actually writing on it, Allahu Alam, but it was a raised circle, and he knew, it was in their book, that that prophet would have this seal, khatam, to indicate that he was the last of the prophets. And so he knew who he was at this point. And he said, whose son is this? Abu Talib says, he's my son. Bahira says, no, his father can't be alive. And then he said, actually, they knew that he was an orphan, that he'd be raised an orphan. So Abu Talib says, he's actually my brother's son, but he died and I'm his uncle. He said, that's correct. And then he said, take him back to Mecca and guard him. And don't let the Jews know about him, because if